a pine box, and a promissory note. That was all Hattie Voss was worth to the men who sold her. The note said $40. The pine box was for whoever argued. Copper Creek in December smelled like frozen mud and broken promises. The kind of town that existed only because the railroad hadn't quite reached anywhere better yet, stranded between two mountain ranges like a bad idea nobody had the energy to abandon. The trading post at the end of Main Street, if you could call 3 blocks of warped timber and desperation a Main Street, was called Alderman's, though old Alderman himself had been dead 6 years. His widow ran the place now, but she'd gone south for the winter and left her nephew in charge, which meant the nephew had been drunk since October, and the store had become effectively a place where men conducted business they couldn't conduct anywhere civilized. Hattie had been conducted there on a Tuesday. She didn't know what day it was by the time the big man walked in. She'd stopped counting days somewhere around the 3rd week with the Greer party, when the distinction between Tuesday and Friday had ceased to matter, the way a lot of things ceased to matter when your wrists were tied to a wagon slat and the temperature had dropped below 0. She knew it was winter. She knew it was late. She knew the fire in Alderman's hearth was the first real heat she'd felt in longer than she wanted to remember, and she knew better than to let herself lean into it, because warmth was always borrowed and the interest rate was brutal. She was sitting on the floor near the far wall when the door opened. Not sitting by choice. Decker had shoved her down when they'd come inside, a casual violence, the same way you'd set a sack of grain against a wall. She'd landed on her hands, her palms burning against the rough plank floor, and she'd stayed there because standing up without permission had stopped being worth what it cost her. The man who came in was enormous. Not in the loud, threatening way Decker was enormous. Decker's size was all bluster and unpredictability, a bull that had learned how much damage it could do and decided to enjoy it. This man was just built the way certain mountains were built, like the earth had put extra effort in. Dense and quiet and apparently permanent. He wore a canvas duster over a heavy wool shirt, and he was coated in trail dust and what looked like 3 days of riding. He had the face of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors, and none of it sleeping particularly well. He went to the counter. He asked for tobacco and dried beans. He did not look at Hattie. Most men looked at Hattie. It was the first thing they did when they walked in, that quick inventory, the assessment. She'd learned to read a lot from that first glance. This man didn't give her one. He stood at the counter with his back to her and waited for the nephew to find the tobacco tin. And Hattie watched him the way she watched everything now, quietly, cataloging exits, calculating distances. Decker was the one who started talking. He always started talking. It was his favorite sound, his own voice, specifically when it was saying something that made other men uncomfortable. "Boy, she is more trouble than she's worth on the trail," Decker announced to the room, which consisted of the nephew, 2 playing cards in the corner, a woman Hattie didn't know who was pretending very hard to be somewhere else, and the big man at the counter. $40, takes her off my hands. Good worker. Quiet. He paused. Mostly quiet. The miners looked up from their cards. One of them smiled in a way that made the back of Hattie's neck go cold. The big man at the counter did not turn around. $40, Decker said again, louder. I'm not feeding her through another mountain crossing. Hattie stared at the floor. The wood grain swam a little. She was very hungry. She had been very hungry for a long time, and she'd found that if she focused on something specific, the pattern of grain in a floorboard, the sound of wind against a window, the hunger became more of a background condition, like weather, like the dull persistent ache in her wrists where the rope had been. She heard the clink of coins on the counter. She did not look up. She heard boots, heavy ones, slow, crossing the floor toward her. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest. A hand appeared in her line of vision, not reaching for her, just open, palm up, extended downward, like an offer. Hattie looked up. It was the man from the counter. Up close, he was older than she'd first thought, mid-30s maybe, with dark eyes set under a heavy brow and a jaw that looked like it had been hit more than once and had simply stopped reacting. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't the assessment. It was something more like the way you'd look at a situation you'd gotten yourself into before you'd thought it all the way through. "Can you walk?" he said. His voice was low, not gentle exactly, but level, like a man who had decided something and wasn't going to change his mind about it. Hattie looked at the hand. She looked at Decker, who was counting the coins on the bar with the focus of a man who had already moved on. She looked back at the hand. She didn't take it. She put her own hand on the floor and pushed herself upright, ignoring the way her legs shook. She would stand on her own. That was the one thing she had left. "Good," the man said, and turned for the door. His name was Brodie, of. She learned that during the first hour of riding, not because he offered it, but because she asked, and asking felt like the only small act of agency available to her. He answered without breaking stride, without elaborating, "Brodie." That was all. Bov. She rode behind him on a gray horse that smelled of pine and honest labor, and she watched the mountains close around them like a door shutting. And she tried to calculate what $40 bought a man in December and what he expected to collect on it. The cabin was 2 hours up the mountain. By the time they arrived, Hattie's hands had gone past cold into a numb white uselessness, and she was holding on to the back of the saddle by instinct more than any real grip. Brodie swung down and turned back to her, and again he didn't offer his hands. He just stood there waiting to see what she'd do. She slid down, her knees buckled. She caught herself on the stirrup and stood there for a moment just breathing until her legs remembered their purpose. "Inside," Brodie said. The cabin was small, one room aloft above, a stone hearth along the north wall, a workbench covered in tools, a shelf with tins and jars, and the particular organized chaos of a person who lived alone and had decided where everything went a long time ago. It smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and something faintly medicinal. Dried herbs, maybe. Yarrow, sage. Brodie lit the fire with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. He did not speak. He filled an iron pot from a water barrel by the door, hung it on the crane over the growing flame, and began opening tins. Hattie stood near the door. She was calculating the room. Not because she wanted to leave. It was 30 degrees outside, and she had no boots, her feet wrapped in flour sacking that had been wet and frozen and thawed so many times it had essentially become a second skin. She was calculating because calculating was what she did now. Where was the door? Where were the windows? How far to the tree line? "Sit," Brodie said, without looking up from the stove. Hattie didn't move. He glanced at her then. His dark eyes swept her posture, the way she was standing just inside the door, weight forward ready, and he looked away again. He pulled a wooden chair out from the table and set it facing the fire, not facing him. "There," he said. "You can watch the door from there." Hattie blinked. She crossed the room and sat in the chair. He was right. From this angle she could see the door and the window beside it. She didn't know what to do with the fact that he'd noticed. He fed her. It was a plain meal, salt pork and dried beans, nothing that required skill or attention. But there was enough of it, and he set it in front of her without ceremony, without expectation. He sat on the other side of the table with his own tin plate and ate without looking at her, his eyes on some middle distance over her shoulder. Hattie ate carefully at first. Then her body overruled her caution, and she ate fast, the way hunger makes a person animal, and she was too tired to be ashamed of it. When the plates were empty, the silence sat between them like a third presence. Brodie leaned back in his chair. He pulled a folding knife from his vest pocket and began cleaning his thumbnail with the tip of it, a slow, absent gesture. "I'm not keeping you," he said. Hattie watched the knife. "I mean what I'm saying," he said. "I didn't buy a piece of property. When the pass clears in spring, you go wherever you're going. Until then," he stopped. He seemed to be choosing words with some care. "I've got space. I've got food. That's all this is." Hattie was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped. A log settled. "What do you want me to do?" she said. "In exchange, you mean yes." Brodie folded the knife and put it away. He looked at her directly for the first time since the cabin, and she made herself hold his gaze the way she'd made herself stand up without taking his hand, because flinching was a luxury she'd stopped being able to afford. "Nothing," he said. Hattie almost laughed. It came out instead as something small and involuntary that was not quite a sound. "That's not how it works," she said. "I know that's not how it's worked," he said. "I'm telling you how it works here." She didn't believe him. She believed he believed it, which was a different thing. But she was too cold and too tired to argue, and the fire was real, and the food had been real, and sometimes you let yourself take the warmth even when you knew the cost was coming. She slept in the loft that night, on a straw-filled mattress with 2 wool blankets over her, listening to the sound of the wind trying to get through the chinking in the logs and failing. Brodie slept below, on a cot near the fire. She heard him pull the bar on the door, heard the chunk of it dropping into its bracket, locking her in. Her chest seized. Tov. Then she heard him settle onto the cot, heard the long exhale of a man lying down after a hard day, and she understood. He'd barred the door to keep out what was outside, not to keep her from what was in. She lay on her back, staring at the rafters, listening to her own heartbeat slow. She didn't sleep for a long time, but she stopped listening for footsteps. Tov. In the morning she found the loft ladder and came down in the gray early light to find Brodie already outside. Through the one small window she could see him at the woodpile, splitting logs with the focus of a man who used physical work the way other men used whiskey. She stood in the cold cabin and made a decision. She built the fire. She found the coffee tin and the grinder and the iron pot, and she made coffee because she needed something to do with her hands and because it was the only currency she had, and she didn't know yet how to operate without offering currency. When Brodie came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, he stopped in the doorway at the smell of it. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," Hattie said. Tov. She poured a mug and set it on the table without looking at him. "Sit down, it's hot." He sat down. He wrapped both hands around the mug. He didn't say thank you, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. Gratitude felt like obligation running backwards, and she was tired of obligation in both directions. They drank coffee in silence. The fire grew. Outside, the wind had died to nothing, and the snow had the clean, muffled quality of a morning that hadn't decided yet what it was going to be. "What's past the eastern ridge?" Hattie asked. "More mountain," Brodie said. "Then the Lander Valley, about 12 miles. Town, small one. Sutler's Post." "Nothing much. Family?" He glanced at her over the rim of his mug. "Mine or yours?" "Yours. I don't have any." He looked back at the fire. "No." She had learned, in the months before Decker, that people's silences told you more than their words, and Brodie's silence on that particular subject had the weight of something that had been set down a long time ago and not picked back up. She didn't push it. They fell into a routine the way snow falls into a valley, gradually, without a decision being made about it. He cut wood and checked trap lines and came back in the afternoon with his hands cold and red and whatever the line had held. She managed the fire, inventoried the food stores, found the dried herbs on the shelf and identified most of them, learned where the water barrel froze overnight and where it didn't. She patched 2 of his shirts without asking, using a needle and thread she found in a tin box under the workbench. He came in one evening and saw the shirts folded on the table and said nothing, but she noticed he put them on without looking for the holes first. He didn't touch her. He didn't stand too close. He moved through the cabin with a practiced awareness of where she was, and she noticed this because it was so unlike anything she'd experienced in the last 2 years that it registered as something almost architectural, the way you notice load-bearing walls. He was not performing kindness. That was what finally cracked something loose in her chest around the 3rd week. There was no audience for what he was doing, no one to witness his decency and confirm it back to him. He was just this way, quietly, stubbornly, alone on a mountain, this way. She didn't know what to do with it. She was sitting by the fire one evening, mending a worn heel on one of her socks. He'd found her a pair that were too large, same as everything else in the cabin, when she heard him come in earlier than usual. His boots on the porch were faster, less measured. She was already half standing before the door opened. He came in with a face she hadn't seen on him before. Not fear exactly, controlled alarm. The kind that comes before something happens rather than after. "We need to talk," he said, "about Decker." Hattie's hands stilled on the sock. "He's been asking questions in Sutler's Post." Brodie closed the door and set the bar, then turned around. His jaw was tight. 2 men from his outfit asking the storekeeper about a woman. Descriptions right. The fire felt suddenly very far away. "He doesn't give up on $40, Hattie said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "No," Brodie said. "I didn't figure he did. What do you want to do?" He looked at her. There it was again. That direct gaze, no softening, no performance. What I want to do isn't the question of. The pass is still closed for another 6 weeks minimum. You can't go over it, and I won't send you into Sutler's Post with Decker's men asking around. He paused. So the question is what we do about them coming here. It was the we that undid her, just slightly, just enough that she had to look at the fire instead of him for a moment. He'll come himself, she said. He doesn't send others for things he considers personal. What does he consider personal? Anything that costs him money. Brodie nodded slowly, the way a man nods when information confirms something he'd already suspected. He went to the wall where the rifle hung on its pegs and lifted it down. He checked the action with the ease of someone who had done it so many times it was barely a conscious act. Then we'll be ready, he said. Hattie watched him. She thought about being ready. She thought about what it would mean to stand her ground somewhere, rather than calculating the exit. She thought about the 2 years before the Decker party, before everything, when she'd been a person who knew exactly where she was and intended to stay there. He'll have at least 2 men with him, she said. I know. He's not going to just ride away because you tell him to. I know that too. Brodie. She waited until he looked at her. He's going to try to hurt you. He will do it without thinking about it, the way he does everything. He doesn't do warning shots. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear. Closer to recognition. The look of a man who had met her particular brand of too much knowledge before and understood what it costs to have it. Neither do I, he said quietly. Decker came on a Saturday. The sky had the flat white ceiling of a storm, thinking it over, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight. Hattie heard the horses before she heard anything else. Copper Creek's trick of carrying sound on cold air, and she was at the window before Brodie had risen from the table. 3 riders, Decker in front because Decker was always in front. 2 men behind him she recognized from the party, Voss and a man called Burl who had a broken nose that had healed at an angle and a habit of cracking his knuckles before he hit something. 3, she said. Brodie was already moving. He pulled his rifle from the wall. He looked at her. Stay inside. Hattie looked at the rifle on the wall, not his, the other one, the older one that she'd noticed on her first day and had been looking at in the weeks since the way you look at something you're pretending not to look at. That one's loaded, Brodie said without turning around. He was already at the door. 40 feet. Brace against the window frame if you use it. He walked out. Hattie crossed the room and lifted the rifle down. She stood inside with it and listened. She heard Decker's voice first.
It always carried
that particular carrying quality of a man who had never been told to lower it. Something about property and money and the particular language of entitlement that wrapped itself in practical terms. $40. What's fair? A man's got a right. She'd heard every variation of that speech. She knew every word before it came. She heard Brodie say once, flat and unadorned, "She's not going." She heard the shift in the horses, the nervous movement that meant something had changed in the energy of the men above them. Hattie moved to the window. Burl was off his horse. He had his hand on a knife at his belt. Voss was staying mounted, which meant he had a rifle too and was keeping a wide angle. Decker was still talking, that endless talking, the machine of his justification running on its own fuel. She raised the window a half-inch. Cold air flooded in. She braced the rifle barrel on the sill. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this the same way she'd noticed the load-bearing walls, as information about her own structure, surprising and useful. She put Voss in her sights, because Voss was the one with the rifle. Because Decker with a knife was a close-range problem and Brodie was a close-range man. But Voss with a rifle from horseback was a different kind of problem, the kind that ended things before they could be resolved. She waited. Decker dismounted. He took 2 steps toward Brodie with the rolling territorial confidence of a man who had never once stood somewhere and been wrong about his own importance. He put his hand on the gun at his hip. Hattie fired. Not at Decker, not at Voss. She put the shot in the snow 6 inches in front of Decker's right boot, and the report of it cracked across the mountain like a door slamming in God's house, and every horse on the property went sideways. Decker froze. The echo died. The horses settled into their panic. In the silence that followed, the sound of another round being levered into the chamber was very clear. Hattie raised her voice through the window opening. That was to show you I can hit what I aim at, she said. The next one isn't a demonstration. Decker turned toward the cabin window. His face went through several things she'd seen on it before. Fury, calculation, something that was not quite fear but was in the same family. Brodie hadn't moved. The pass opens in 6 weeks, Hattie said. You want your $40, Decker. You'll have it when the pass opens. That's my offer. You can take it, or you can see what else I'm offering. The second rifle, Brodie's, was steady, aimed at the space between Voss and the tree line. Decker looked at Brodie. He looked at the cabin window. He was doing the same calculation she'd spent 2 years watching him do, the one where he weighed what he wanted against what it was going to cost him to take it. This was the first time the cost had looked this high. He spat in the snow. He turned and put his boot in the stirrup and mounted up. He said something to Voss and Burl, low and ugly, and they turned their horses. They rode down the mountain without looking back. Hattie lowered the rifle. Her arms ached. She hadn't noticed them aching before. She heard Brodie's boots on the porch. The door opened. He looked at her standing at the window with the rifle, still braced, not quite ready to put it down. He looked at the window, at the angle she'd had, at the footprints in the snow where Decker had been standing. 6 inches, he said. I wasn't trying to warn him, Hattie said. I was trying to get his attention. Warning would have been 3 inches. Something in his face changed. It wasn't a smile, exactly, but the set of his jaw loosened and the look in his eyes shifted towards something she hadn't seen before from him. Something that was specifically about her, about seeing her, that had nothing to do with practicality or pity. She put the rifle back on the wall. Her hands were shaking now, delayed, the body's bookkeeping catching up. She pressed them flat against the rough wood of the wall and breathed. She felt him behind her, not close, just present, the specific gravity of him in the small room. You didn't have to stay inside, he said. I know, she said, but the angle was better from the window. Hattie, she turned around. He was close enough that she had to look up slightly, and she found him watching her with that same direct steadiness, the look that never seemed to be performing anything. Are you all right? He said. Nobody had asked her that in so long that the words landed strangely, took a moment to parse. Not particularly, she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said since she arrived. He nodded, once, like that was a fair answer. Coffee's still on the stove, he said. She almost told him she didn't want coffee. She almost said something sharp and self-sufficient and closed. Instead, she walked past him to the stove, picked up the pot, and poured 2 cups. She set his on the table without looking at him. She sat down. After a moment, he sat across from her. The fire burned. Outside, the snow that had been thinking about it finally made up its mind and began to fall, quiet and serious, adding another layer of white to the mountain, covering the tracks and the evidence and the morning as if none of it had happened, and all that had ever existed was this: a fire, a table, 2 people, the slow particular warmth of a thing that had started as $40 and a desperate situation, and had become without either of them deciding it, something that mattered. Hattie wrapped both hands around the mug. She thought about the pass opening in 6 weeks. She thought about the Lander Valley and Sutler's Post and the open country beyond, all the places a person could go when they finally had the option to go somewhere. She thought about the word we, and how Brodie had said it like it was simply factual, like they were already the kind of people who faced things together. She hadn't corrected him. The snow fell. The coffee was strong and bitter and real. Across the table, Brodie drank his in silence, and his silence, she had learned, was not emptiness, it was weight ballast, the particular piece of a person who had also put a lot of things down and was still standing. She didn't know what spring would look like. She didn't know what $40 meant at the end of it, or what she'd do with the open pass and the open country on the other side. She didn't know how to be a person who let warmth in without waiting for the cost. But she knew this cabin. She knew this fire. She knew that Brodie had noticed which chair gave her a sightline to the door, and that he'd never once asked her to put the rifle back. It wasn't everything, but it was the first thing in 2 years that had felt, quietly and without announcement, like a beginning.